I'm talking about what we might get from Gaelic tradition and a Gaelic viewpoint on whisky. And I thought the obvious link to make was with this notion of friend or foe in Gaelic tradition, which is a rich vein in the Gaelic song tradition, Gaelic poetry tradition, Gaelic literature, and can be quite directly traced to origins, particularly, I'm sorry to say, being the foe in Gaelic tradition. Anyway, obviously with whisky, we've got this link to the notion of a national drink and the proverbial elixir of life. And I was intrigued when I checked on what elixir meant, that it was an invigorating liquid or alcohol, and it had the power of indefinitely prolonging life, which is a testing idea. So the notion is also quite current. I think that probably we invented whisky, and if we didn't, we certainly made it very much our own. And going back to medieval times and before that, indeed into prehistory for the origins of distilling. So we won't particularly go there now, but with its ingredients of barley, peat and water, and the notion of being produced in the hills, it has a mystique and a charisma which is very attractive. And I've just, as a reminder to recall the processes of manufacture and distilling, a picture of a group of peat spades and a creel for collecting the peat and bringing it in to the still. And in Daniel's talk, he mentioned the Battle of the Black Pot. And of course, this is the reference to a Forch Gu, the Black Pot. And we have a little illustration from Dwelly's Gaelic Dictionary from the beginning of the 20th century, where what is valuable about this little illustration is that there's a gathering of terms, all the Gaelic terms for the different parts of the still. And you see on the left-hand side the barrel with the worm, the circular worm going through it. And the worm is known as a clear in Gaelic, a very common name, a very common word. But interestingly, in current dictionaries, clear doesn't have, amongst its definitions or meanings, does not have the meaning of the whisky worm, the distilling worm. So that's something maybe that's passing out of memory. But underneath the reference to Dwelly's dictionary, there's a very little line or two, couplet from a very famous Gaelic song, and it's important because it uses the metaphor of, it turns the worm and the distilling process into the metaphor of the sheep with the crooked horn. Obviously, that is the reference to the circular worm. Well, friend or foe of whisky, where do we start? This is a very typical song, Molag Anushka Behe, the praise of whisky, by the poet William Ross, late 18th century. And it again uses the notion of metaphor. It metaphorizes, as it were, the whisky as a whole. It turns it into his friend and his the vigor of the whisky and how it's how lively and spirited it is. Now, I've taken another verse out of this song, Molag Anushka Behe, because it refers to Ferrintosh, which we'll come back to briefly at the end. Ferrintosh was distillery in the Black Isle, which was having been destroyed in 1689 in one of the Jacobite wars, was then as a As a reward for his loyalty to the government, Forbes of Culloden, to whom Ferrintosh Distillery belonged, was allowed to distill whisky free of excise duties. And so it grew a reputation as a very good whisky, and obviously a licensed whisky and so on, a whisky that was not illegal as opposed to so much else of whisky distilling. Well, if that was the friend of whisky, here we have the foe, and the moral message. It isn't the water of life, but the water of death. The water that has tortured my heart in my breast, the water that left my head grey, the water that has left hundreds destitute. And this comes from a little verse composed by the minister of Arasaig in about 1800, 1820. And it was printed in 1821, but I've just chosen a later printing of it from 1876, because this probably is the dynamic behind the conversion of whisky from being the friend to being the foe, and that is the temperance movement. And the 1876 date was in the middle of the temperance movement period, beginning in the 1830s and 40s, and perhaps rising to almighty heights with prohibition in the States and so forth in the early 20th century. But this is a very important ingredient, as it were, in the idea of whisky being a foe, an enemy. The other important thing about this reference in 1876 was that along with the verse, it included almost a sermon of several thousand words as to why we should avoid whisky at all costs. And in fact, the title of the sermon that is included in the reference, Oeveren son vi Shachnig anord, the reasons to be avoiding the drink. And of course, the drink is the strong drink. Well, the history of whisky in Gaelic Scotland is slightly perhaps confused in the way it's written, in that there is considerable amount of references to aqua vitae, the water of life, right through from the Middle Ages into the 17th, indeed 18th century. And here is its reference in the medical manuscripts, which again is very typical, a citation about these sort of spirits. But the term must be said to be uncertain. It could be a form of brandy, but probably certainly some sort of spirit distilled from wine. And it formed, the important thing was that it formed a medicine that was a panacea for all disorders. And this is carried forward in Gaelic tradition, where we have little sayings like "She liches gachines joch vilish and dram." The healing of every sickness is the sweet drink of the dram. Now, this takes the notion forward of the aqua vitae as medicine from the early times, but with the lineup of the equation between aqua vitae and uisce beatha as whisky in Gaelic, the notion is that aqua vitae or uisce beatha was what was being referred to in the medical manuscript. So there's an area of uncertainty which could do with more research. Daniel was mentioning the statutes of Iona, and I just wonder if there's been a slight bowdlerization of this, that aqua vitae is assumed to be whisky, but may not be what was meant at the time. I'm not sure. Again, something that could usefully be researched and cleared up. Notice, though, that the main element in the extraordinary drinking is of wine, of strong wines. And this was something that is mentioned later on, this very fine collection of information in David Stewart of Garth's sketches of the character, manners and present state of the Highlands of Scotland. He writes till within the last 30 years, so he's talking about 1790s, whisky was less used in the Highlands than rum and brandy, which were landed on the west coast and thence conveyed all over the country. Indeed, it was not until the middle of last century that spirits of any kind were so much drunk as ale, which was formerly the universal beverage. And of course, he makes the point that whereas ale and beers were drunk by everybody, French wines and brandy were the drink of a social elite. Now, to go back into the what is available in Gaelic song, and there's a huge amount of song that refers to drink and most importantly to hospitality as a whole. This is a little piece, Oran Regal of Bottle, the royal song of the bottle by the great Gaelic poet Alexander MacDonald of Dalalay. And I just lifted out this particular verse because I thought it was interesting. It's if you like, it's ethnological detail where he's talking about the drinking cup is the scallop shell, and he makes quite a sophisticated joke about scallop is bad Gaelic, and but at the same time it is the shell that plundered us. In other words, he's maybe admitting that whisky and strong drink could well be an enemy of straight living. Just to look at drinking cups, there's a little silver cuach or quaich, little wooden quaich, and 2 scallop shells. So you can see that the quaich is a shallow cup, and you're probably getting the same amount of whisky in the scallop shell as you are in a little quaich. Well, the prevailing note from the 17th century is where we have a prolific amount of vernacular Gaelic song as opposed to classical bardic Gaelic song. Vernacular Gaelic song in the 17th century coming to the fore, and we have a very vivid picture of the hospitality offered and proffered in the houses of the chieftains, and the expectations of the people and the bards of lots of hospitality and generosity and conviviality. So there is this atmosphere of drinking and conviviality, as I was saying, but the prevailing note is of, well, we see here in the third line, whether it is brandy or beer. So that's not what, whisky is not what was expected at the time. It was, if you like, brandy, which would be the exclusive imported drink, and beer, which would be the drink in great quantities. So you've got your choice there. You can sip a brandy or you can quaff a beer. So that's very important. Just to mention another poet of this period, we have Mary MacLeod, Mari Nian Alistair Roy, and just maybe this would be picked up on the camera, a new book of a new edition of her poetry, and in that we have another very, very important exploration and evocation of the culture of the clans, and for example, the drinking of wines again, and the expectations of the people of the clans of the generosity and the liberality and hospitality of their chieftain. So that I very much recommend that in order to pick up on social and ethnological detail from a great literary collection, which is perhaps usually and most normally up till now used for its analysis of Gaelic and its editing of Gaelic and its literary qualities, but it is a book simply stuffed with a view of life in the 17th century. Mary MacLeod, Mary Nian Alsteroy, born about 1615, lived a long life, dying about 1707. So a very, very important source, and of course bringing us in on strong drinks. Another from Alexander MacDonald is significant again for its choice of drinks. It's interesting that he says, let's not go to the pub, the gin's not worth it. And of course, he was composing at a time when gin was a scourge in the British Isles. Notice that the word for gin in Gaelic is Sinever, because gin is Geneva, is the etymology of gin is Geneva, at least I believe it is. So in Gaelic, Sinever is the Gaelic for gin. And it goes on, and then the second verse, which I've chosen out of sequence, but it's important because it mentions a political issue here, which also begins to colour the whole story of whisky in Gaelic Scotland. In other words, it lines whisky drinking and hospitality up with the name of James. So this is James VII and James VIII and the Jacobites, and the equation of the distilling of whisky and with Jacobitism. Now, the explanation here, which is very significant, is that in the 18th century, with the growth of what we might describe as excessive drinking, and how drinking, as we see in the poetry of Robert Burns, drinking is turned into an art form in itself. But what Alexander MacDonald is referring to is the distilling that was going on all around the Highlands, and how alignment with Jacobitism and opposition to the established government would lead you to achieve freedom from the taxes imposed on whisky. Now, the chronology of this was that Daniel had mentioned 1660, early excise duties, and how Cromwell was more lenient on the distilling. 1660, a return to an earlier excise duty. 1707, the Union of the Crowns, establishment of the Board of Excise, and then excise duties rising steadily throughout the 18th century, and a series of excise acts, each one more unpopular than the one before it. So antagonism to legislation in the Gaelic tradition appears as part of the picture of loyalty to the Jacobite movement. But beyond that, with the end of the Jacobite Wars in 1745-46, then you get a rise in the amount of distilling and illicit distilling in spite of the excise laws, and distilling to avoid taxation, and then to the point that distilling on a small scale was normal throughout the Highlands and indeed islands, where the surplus grade, where it existed, was converted into whisky to pay the rent, and to the extent that it was regarded as almost a respectable business to defy the excise laws and to refuse to pay duties. And in this period, the whole picture of illicit distilling took off, as we've seen and heard from Daniel. Just as an example of distilling in the Highlands, this still is in the collections of the West Highland Museum, Fort William, and was left on the doorstep of the museum in the 1920s or 30s. And sorry to say, from the point of view of a museum exhibit, the authorities had stoved in the side of it in order that it couldn't be used again, even though it was left for the museum itself. So this is it with its destroyed side. And anyway, this of course is the story of illicit distilling, which is such, well, a vicious one most of the time, a vicious one. And the concept of the hidden stills in the hills. This is a nice little vignette here because it shows whiskey being transported on a sledge, the casks of whiskey being taken away from the bohan, the bothy, the distilling hut, or to market or for sale. And another rather later, more detailed picture, part of the romantic imagery of illicit distilling. This one by the artist McKeon in the early 19th century, rather slightly older contemporary of Edwin Landseer. And another landmark in the hotting up, if you like, of the whole picture of illicit distilling was the 1787 Act, which prevented stills of of less than 500 gallons being used. And this meant that this put a huge amount of pressure on those who wanted to distill at home and to distill free of tax to carry on. So the just to conclude on the illicit distilling and the other sort of notion of the friend and foe of whiskey, the friends being the those who are profiting from it, and the foes being the excisemen and the gaugers. This is a little note from Abriachan on the north side of Loch Ness, and I think it's rather typical of the late 19th, the 19th century, and the recalling of tradition, how that the different areas of the Highlands vied with each other almost for being the most cunning and the most effective smugglers. So just to finish off, I've invited you, Carriage no Navich, Ollie Shin Jochlan, friend or foe, we'll drink a toast anyway. And I've shamelessly used Ian Noble's bottles of Gaelic whisky as the invocation and invitation to have a dram, whether it's our friend or our enemy. Well, thanks very much.